He rejected her in front of the entire pack, stood on the platform at her presentation ceremony, looked her dead in the eye, and said the words that ended everything. Juniper Hale has spent 3 years rebuilding a life where nobody knows what those words cost her. She has a shop that smells like cinnamon and cedar, a found family who would burn down the world for her, and a rule she has never once broken: never go back to Ashwood Hollow. So when the alpha who destroyed her shows up on her doorstep, soaked from the rain, looking like a man who hasn't slept in 3 years either, and says her name like it's the only word he remembers how to say, Juniper has exactly one thought. He is 3 years too late. Juniper Hale had built her entire adult life around a single, private theory that time did in fact heal everything, provided you kept yourself busy enough not to notice it happening. It was not a scientifically rigorous theory. It had never been tested in a lab. But she had tested it, personally, for 3 years, and so far the results were promising. Mostly promising. Promising on the days that ended before 9 at night, before the shop closed, and the quiet crept in, and she was left alone with her own thoughts, which had never once, not on a single occasion, been trustworthy company. The bell over the shop door chimed, and Juniper looked up from the piping bag in her hand, expecting Delia with the flower delivery. Or possibly the retired postman who came in every Tuesday to complain about the price of butter and buy 4 cinnamon rolls anyway. She was not expecting rain. She was not expecting the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when something large and unignorable stepped into it. She looked up, and her hands simply stopped working. He filled the doorway the way certain kinds of weather fill a sky, not gradually, but suddenly, all at once, undeniable, broader than she remembered, though her memory of him had never exactly been generous on that front, either. Dark hair plastered to his forehead from the rain, a coat that had clearly been expensive once and was currently ruined, and eyes pale gold, wolf-bright even in human shape, locked on her with an intensity that made every hair on her arms stand up in immediate, involuntary alarm. Weston Calloway, Alpha of Ashwood Hollow. The man who had stood in front of 200 pack members 3 years ago and rejected her so completely, so publicly, that she had left that night and never once looked back, not even to collect the boxes she'd left in her old room, which as far as she knew were still there, gathering dust in a house that was no longer any part of her life. "You're bleeding on my floor," Juniper said, because it was true, and because it was infinitely easier to say than any of the 600 other things crowding her throat. He looked down at his hand, as if he'd genuinely forgotten it was attached to him. There was a gash along his knuckles, already closing wolves healed fast. She remembered that much. Remembered it more than she wanted to, but it had bled enough to leave a thin, dark trail down his wrist. "I didn't notice," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, too. Rougher. And quieter. Like something in it had worn down. "Of course you didn't." Juniper set the piping bag down with more care than it required, mostly because her hands had started shaking and she needed a task to steady them. "You never did notice things that were inconvenient to notice." Something flickered across his face. She used to be able to read every single thing that crossed that face. Back when she'd been foolish enough to think that meant something, that being able to read a man meant he'd let you close enough to matter. She couldn't read it now. 3 years was apparently long enough to lose a language. "Juniper," he said. Just her name. Like it cost him something to say it, like he'd been rationing it, saving it up for an occasion he hadn't been sure would ever come. "Don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. Sharp enough that Delia, in the back room, went suspiciously quiet. The way a person goes quiet when they are absolutely still working, but have also started listening very hard. "Don't do that. Don't stand in my shop and say my name like that. You don't get to do that." "I know." He said it immediately, without argument. which threw her more than an argument would have. The Weston she remembered had never once, in the 2 years she'd known him before that night, said the words "I know" without following them, with a but. I know I don't get to. I'm not asking for anything. I needed to see you. You needed to see me. Juniper laughed, and it came out uglier than she meant it to. An old scar of a laugh. One that hurt more than it should have, 3 years out. You had 3 years, Weston. 3 years to need to see me. You had my address the entire time. Don't look at me like that. I know your betas know exactly where I moved. They're not subtle, and you're choosing tonight. In the rain. Bleeding on my floor. Something's wrong with the pack, he said. That stopped her. Not because she cared, she told herself immediately, firmly, that she did not care, but because Weston Calloway did not say sentences like that. Weston Calloway said sentences like the borders are secure, and the harvest tithe is due, and I've made my decision, walking away before anyone could argue with it. He did not say something's wrong in a voice that cracked slightly in the middle, like the words had teeth and they'd bitten him on the way out. What do you mean wrong? She said, before she could stop herself, before the part of her brain still loyal to old instincts could be overruled by the part that had spent 3 years learning not to ask. The land is dying, he said. Slowly, the wards are thinning. 2 of my sentries collapsed on patrol last month. No injury, no cause. They just went down, like something had been pulled out from under them. Our healer says it's not sickness, says it's something structural, something at the root of the pack itself. He paused, and his throat worked, and Juniper watched him decide whether to say the next part, watched him lose the argument with himself. She says it started 3 years ago. The bell over the door had gone quiet. Delia had stopped pretending to work in the back. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and indifferent, the way rain does regardless of what it's interrupting. That's not my problem, Juniper said, and her voice only shook a little. I know, Weston said again, and this time it sounded like it was killing him to say it. I know it's not. I'm not here to make it your problem. I'm here because I don't have anyone else to ask, and because I have spent 3 years telling myself I did the right thing, and I don't believe that anymore, and I needed. He stopped. Started again. I needed to see your face when I said that out loud. Juniper stood very still behind her counter, an entire shop's worth of flour and sugar and warm cinnamon air between them, and felt the careful architecture of the last 3 years shift, very slightly, on its foundation. You should go, she said. It was not what she meant. It was the only thing she trusted herself to say. He nodded, like he'd expected exactly that, like he'd rehearsed for this outcome and built himself the strength to survive it. He turned toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame, rain still dripping steadily from his coat onto her floor, and said, without turning around, for what it's worth. I have regretted that night every single day since it happened. I know that doesn't undo it. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I just needed you to know that it was the worst thing I have ever done, and I have not once stopped paying for it. Then, he was gone, out into the rain, and Juniper stood alone in her shop with her heart going too fast, and her hands still shaking, and a small, treacherous voice in the back of her mind that she thought she had killed 3 years ago, whispering, what if he means it? 3 years earlier, Juniper had believed, with the kind of stupid, total faith that only exists before you've been given a reason not to have it, that Weston Calloway loved her. Not suspected, not hoped. Believed, the way she believed the sun would rise, a fact so foundational she had never once thought to build a contingency plan around its opposite. The presentation ceremony was supposed to be a formality. Every unmated wolf who came of age within Ashwood Hollow stood before the pack once a year, and the alpha, whoever he was, whatever his private life looked like, spoke a blessing over them, welcomed them formally into full pack standing. It was tradition. It was boring. Usually, Juniper had sat through 6 of them before her own, watching other people's names get called, other people's blessings get spoken, thinking almost nothing about it at all. She had not expected her own to be different. She had certainly not expected it to be the worst night of her life. She remembered the platform, the torches, the 200 faces turned up toward her, all of them already knowing, because pack gossip traveled faster than sound, that she and the Alpha had been whatever they had been for 2 years. Not officially mated, not officially anything, but enough that everyone had assumed the presentation ceremony would simply be the moment it became public and permanent. She remembered Weston standing across from her on that platform, and the way his jaw had been set in a line she'd never seen before, not once in 2 years. Not even during the worst of the border disputes with the Ironwood Pack. She remembered thinking, in the half-second before he opened his mouth, that something was wrong, that she should reach for his hand, that she should do something. She had not moved fast enough. "I reject this bond," he'd said, loud enough for 200 people to hear, loud enough that there was no possible way to later pretend it had been a misunderstanding, a private conversation gone wrong, a moment either of them could walk back. "Juniper Hale is not my mate. She never will be." The silence afterward had a texture to it, a physical weight, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes it difficult to remember how breathing works. Juniper remembered standing on that platform with 200 pairs of eyes on her, and Weston already turning away, already walking off the platform like he could not stand to be near what he'd just done, and she remembered thinking, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its brutality, "I need to leave tonight." Not this week. Tonight, she had. She'd walked back to her room, packed one bag, and left before dawn, and she had not spoken a single word to anyone from Ashwood Hollow in 3 years, except a handful of old friends who had found her afterward, in the city, and refused to let the friendship die just because she had. What she had never known what she had, spent 3 years successfully not wondering about, because wondering about it would have meant leaving the door open a crack, and she had needed that door bricked shut, was why. She found out on the walk back into the shop, after Weston had already disappeared into the rain, when Delia finally emerged from the back room, with an expression that suggested she had heard every word and had opinions about all of them. "You're going, aren't you?" Delia said. It was not a question. "I am absolutely not going," Juniper said, already reaching for her coat. Delia, who had known Juniper for 2 years, who had watched her cry into a mixing bowl more nights than either of them liked to count, who had never once during that time said anything crueler than pass the vanilla, raised one unimpressed eyebrow and said nothing at all, because she did not need to. "It's the land," Juniper said, mostly to herself, mostly to justify the coat she was already buttoning. "People could be hurt. Sentries are collapsing. That's not about him. That's about people. Real people. Elend's still there. Little Rosalind's not so little anymore. She's probably presenting soon herself, and if something's wrong with the pack bond, she stopped, because she'd heard herself and hated how easily the old vocabulary had come back. Pack bond, sentries, wards. Like she'd never left. Like 3 years hadn't happened at all. "I didn't say anything," Delia said. "You didn't have to." Delia crossed the shop, took Juniper's face in both flour-dusted hands, and looked at her with the particular seriousness she usually reserved for burnt batches of croissants. "I'm not going to tell you not to go," she said. "I watched what that man did to you. I would very much like to hit him with something heavy. But I also watched you spend 3 years building a life you're actually proud of, and I need you to go because you want to help people, and not because some part of you is still standing on that platform waiting for him to take it back." Juniper opened her mouth to argue, found she didn't have one, and closed it again. I'm going because sentries are collapsing, she said finally. Which was true, and also not the whole truth, and both of them knew it. Sure, Delia said, releasing her face and turning back toward the ovens, in the tone of someone who had decided to let a lie live in peace for exactly as long as it needed to. Take the good boots. It's a long walk back to a place you swore you'd never see again. The road to Ashwood Hollow had not changed, which Juniper found almost offensive. 3 years, and the same crooked fence post leaned at the same angle past the mill bridge. The same oak split the road in two just before the tree line, forcing travelers to choose left or right, a choice that had felt significant to her once, back when she'd believed everything about this place was significant. She took the left, the way she always had, and felt her chest tighten with every step, an old ache waking up out of a long sleep and stretching, testing its limits. Weston had not come with her. He'd offered, of course he'd offered, standing awkwardly on her doorstep the next morning with a horse she hadn't asked for, and an expression like a man bracing for a door to be slammed in his face, and she had told him, with a coolness that had taken real effort to manufacture, that she would find her own way there. Thank you. And he could meet her at the border. He was there when she arrived. Of course he was. Waiting exactly where the wards used to hum against her skin. A low, pleasant static she remembered without meaning to. The feeling of a place recognizing you as its own. There was no static now. Just Weston, standing very still, watching her walk the last 100 yards toward him with an expression she still, infuriatingly, could not read. You feel it, he said, when she was close enough. It wasn't a question. I feel nothing, Juniper said, which was almost a lie, because what she felt was the specific, awful absence of something that used to be there, a held note that had simply stopped playing. The wards had always felt like warmth against her skin. Once, now the border felt like any other stretch of ordinary forest. Colder for what it used to be. That's the problem, Weston said quietly. Exactly that. Nothing. Elin found her within the hour, which surprised Juniper not even slightly, because Elin had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to know when something interesting had entered a 100-mile radius. She came barreling out of the healer's cottage with her sleeves rolled up and not flour, some kind of poultice smeared across one cheek, and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of Juniper standing in the yard. You're here, Elin said, in the tone of someone confirming a rumor she had refused, on principle, to believe. I'm here, Juniper agreed. Elin crossed the yard in 4 long strides and hugged her hard enough to lift her slightly off her feet, and for one unguarded second Juniper let herself feel exactly how much she had missed this not the pack, not the politics, not any of the complicated architecture of belonging to something larger than yourself, but this, specifically, an old friend's arms and an old friend's smell and the unbearable relief of being known. I have approximately 400 questions, Ellen said, releasing her, and I am going to ask none of them right now, because you look like you're about to bolt, and also because I have a much bigger problem currently occupying most of my brain, which is that 2 sentries collapsed on the Eastern Line yesterday, and I still don't know why. Show me, Juniper said, and was faintly, uncomfortably surprised by how much she meant it. The healer's cottage smelled the way it always had, dried herbs and beeswax, and something sharp underneath that Juniper had never identified in 2 years of visiting. 2 cots held 2 young wolves she recognized one, barely. A boy who'd been a child the last time she'd seen him, and was now built like a young oak, both of them breathing. Both of them alive. Both of them entirely. Eerily unresponsive, eyes open and unfocused, staring at nothing. It's not injury, Elin said, moving between them with the brisk efficiency of someone who had run out of patience for her own helplessness. No fever, no wound, no poison I can identify. Their wolves have gone quiet, like something reached in and switched them off. Since when? Juniper asked. Since the wards started thinning. Eileen looked up, and there was something careful in her expression, something Juniper recognized as the look of a friend deciding how much truth to hand someone all at once. It's getting worse, Junie. Faster every week. Whatever's wrong, it's not going to fix itself, and half the betas think it's some kind of curse, and the other half think Weston's just losing his grip on the pack bond because she stopped herself. Too late. Because he's what? Juniper said. Eileen sighed. The particular sigh of someone who had wanted to avoid a subject and had walked directly into it anyway, because a pack bond is only as strong as its alpha's connection to his own mate, she said gently, like she was handling something breakable. That's not superstition, Junie. That's just how it works. An alpha who rejects his true mate doesn't just break his own heart. He weakens the whole structure underneath him. It's why nobody's ever done it before, not in 3 generations of pack history. It's not just cruel, it's structurally catastrophic. And I think she hesitated again. I think it took 3 years to fully show, because bonds don't collapse all at once. They erode. But I think we're watching the foundation finally give. Juniper stood very still in the herb-scented quiet of the cottage, looking down at a boy she remembered as a child, now lying hollow-eyed on a cot because of a decision that had, until this exact moment, felt like it only belonged to her. He didn't tell me that part, she said quietly. He probably doesn't fully believe it yet, Ellen said. Or he believes it completely, and that's exactly why he can't say it out loud. She found Weston at the edge of the eastern tree line that evening, exactly where a sentry told her he'd be, standing with his back to the pack and his eyes on the failing wards like a man keeping vigil at a deathbed. He didn't turn when she approached. He must have scented her from 50 yards out, must have heard every twig she stepped on, and still he didn't turn, like he'd made himself a rule about not reaching for things until they came to him first. Eileen told me what happens, Juniper said, stopping a careful 6 feet behind him. Close enough to talk, far enough that neither of them had to pretend the distance wasn't deliberate. About the bond. About what a rejection does to the whole structure. His shoulders tensed, a small, involuntary flinch, like she'd pressed on something still raw after 3 years. I didn't want you to come here out of guilt, he said. I'm not here out of guilt. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but it was true enough to say out loud. I'm here because 2 boys are lying on cots with nothing behind their eyes, and because whatever this is, it's not going to stop unless somebody understands it. I need you to actually talk to me, Weston, not apologize. Not perform remorse at me like it's a currency you're trying to spend down. Talk to me. Why did you do it? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might simply refuse, might retreat back into the careful, controlled alpha voice she remembered from council meetings, the one that gave nothing away. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him in 3 years, not even standing in her shop, bleeding, in the rain. My father died protecting my mother, he said. You knew that. Everyone knows that story, the Ironwood raid, the border collapse, the last stand at the mill bridge. It's practically a bedtime story around here. Brave alpha. Dead protecting his mate. Tragic and noble and worth singing songs about. He shook his head slowly. What they don't sing about is what it did to the pack after. My father wasn't just my father. He was the anchor for 200 people's sense of safety, and when he died protecting one person, he left the rest of us undefended for 11 days before the pack bond stabilized under someone new. 11 days. People died in that gap, Juniper. People who weren't his mate, People whose only crime was needing an alpha who was capable of thinking about anything other than the one person he loved most. So you thought, Juniper said slowly, piecing it together even as her chest went tight and cold, that loving me would make you like him. Distractible, breakable, a liability to everyone else. I thought, Weston said, and his voice cracked fully now, no careful control left in it at all, that I would be a danger to this entire pack the moment I let myself need you the way I already needed you. I watched you at the border with the Ironwood Scouts 6 months before the ceremony. Some idiot boy got too close, drew a knife he had no business carrying, and I have never in my life felt what I felt in that half second before I got to you. Not fear. Something worse than fear. Something that told me, very clearly, that if it ever came down to a choice between your safety and this pack's, I would not hesitate for even a second before choosing you, and 200 people would pay for that choice the way I paid for my father's. He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were wet. Actually, wet. Something she had genuinely never once seen from him in 2 years of knowing him. So I decided the safest thing I could do, for you and for everyone else, was to make sure I never had to make that choice at all. You didn't ask me, Juniper said, and her own voice was shaking now too. You didn't sit me down and say any of this. You stood on a platform in front of 200 people and destroyed me instead, and you let me believe for 3 years that I simply wasn't enough, that there was something wrong with me, some fundamental flaw you'd finally seen clearly enough to reject. Do you understand what that did? Do you have any idea what 3 years of that does to a person? I know, he said, and it broke in the middle. I know. And it was the wrong choice. It was the single worst choice I have ever made. And I have spent 3 years watching this pack fall apart in slow motion as the price for a decision I told myself was noble. And I don't. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, hard, like he could physically push the emotion back down. I don't know how to fix it, Juniper. I don't know if it can be fixed. I only know that watching those boys on those cots today made it very clear that I was wrong about which kind of danger you were. You were never the danger. I was. Juniper stood in the deepening dark of the tree line, close enough now to smell the rain still clinging to his coat from the night before. Close enough to see every year of exhaustion carved into his face, and felt something in her chest that she did not have a name for, yet not forgiveness. Not quite. Not this fast. Not after 3 years. But something adjacent to it. Something that had started, very quietly, to shift. I still don't know if I can trust you, she said honestly. I'm not asking you to, Weston said. I'm asking you to help me save 2 boys who never asked to pay for my mistake. Everything else can wait, as long as it needs to. It was, she would think later, exactly the right thing to say, not a declaration, not a plea for her heart, just an honest ask for her help, wrapped around an honesty about his fault that he had clearly, visibly, had to fight himself to give her. And it was that, more than anything, that made her finally close the last 6 feet of distance between them and say, quietly, show me where the wards are thinnest. Let's start there. They worked the failing border for 3 days, and something in the working of it, in the shared purpose of it, began to wear away at the careful distance Juniper had built between them without either of them ever discussing it out loud. It was easier, she found, to talk to Weston, with her hands full of warding stones and her mind on the mechanics of a dying spell, than it had ever been to talk to him about anything that actually mattered. Grief, apparently, was easier sideways. The old wards were built in layers, Weston explained on the second morning, kneeling beside her at the base of the split oak, tracing a symbol into the dirt with his finger. My grandfather's generation set the foundation. My father reinforced it after the Ironwood raid. Every alpha adds to what's already there, in theory. Except I never did. I never sealed my own layer over the top, because sealing a layer requires he stopped. Requires what? Juniper said, though she suspected she already knew. A mate's blessing, he said quietly. It's not political. It's not symbolic. It's structural. You literally cannot finish an alpha's ward work alone. My father couldn't have sealed his lair without my mother standing beside him at this exact tree, the night he became alpha. I never sealed mine because there was never anyone standing beside me who I was willing to ask. He glanced at her sideways, something raw and unguarded in his face. There still isn't, unless you count the fact that I'm currently kneeling next to the only person I've ever wanted there. Juniper's hands stilled over the stones. Weston, I'm not asking you to bless anything, he said quickly, before she could finish whatever she'd been about to say. I know exactly how that would sound, and I know exactly how little right I have to ask it. I'm telling you the truth, because you asked for the truth, and because I'm done managing what I say to you, based on what I think will make me look less like the person who broke everything. I broke it. This is what it looks like broken. I thought you deserved to see the whole shape of it. They didn't finish the ward that day, or the next. The rival pack, Ironwood, chose the third night to test the weakness they'd clearly been watching for weeks, a small raiding party, 6 wolves, testing the eastern line where the wards had thinned to almost nothing, probing for exactly the kind of collapse Elin had warned about. Juniper woke to the sound of the alarm horn, deep and continuous, the sound she remembered from 3 years ago and had hoped never to hear again, and was pulling on her boots before she'd fully processed why. The fight, when she reached the tree line, was already underway, chaos of snarling and shifted fur in the moonlight, sentries who should have had the ward's support fighting without it, exposed and slower than they should have been. She saw Weston at the center of it, already shifted, a massive dark shape moving with a speed and violence that made her chest ache with old, complicated feelings, protecting a line of unshifted, unprepared wolves with his body between them and the raiders. She saw the moment it went wrong. A raider broke past the flank, fast, low, aimed not at Weston but at the healer's cottage, at the 2 unconscious boys still lying helpless on their cots, and Juniper did not think, did not weigh the risk, simply moved, putting herself directly in the path of a wolf twice her size, with nothing but a warding stone in her fist and absolutely no plan beyond stop him. She heard Weston's roar before she felt anything else. Felt the impact a half-second later, not from the raider, but from Weston himself, shoving her bodily out of the strike zone with a force that sent her sprawling into the dirt, taking the blow meant for her across his own shoulder, teeth sinking deep enough that she heard the sound of it, a wet, tearing crunch that turned her stomach even as she scrambled back to her feet. The fight ended minutes later, Ashwood's sentries, rallying around their wounded alpha with a ferocity that told Juniper everything about what he meant to them, drove the raiders back across the border in a rout. But by the time the horn sounded the all-clear, Weston was down on one knee in the dirt, shifted back to human, blood soaking through the shoulder of his ruined shirt, and Juniper was on her knees beside him before she'd made a conscious decision to move. "You absolute idiot," she said, hands shaking as she pressed her palms against the wound, trying to remember everything Elin had ever taught her about field triage. "You absolute, reckless, self-sacrificing idiot. You could have let him hit me. I had a rock. I had a plan. You did not have a plan," Weston said. And despite everything, despite the blood soaking her hands, there was the faintest thread of dry humor in his voice, the first joke she'd heard from him in 3 years. "You had a rock and an expression I recognize from every terrible decision you made when we were together. That's not the point." The point, he said, catching her bloodied hand in his own, and holding it still against his chest, right over the wild, uneven rhythm of his heart, is that I told you 3 years ago that choosing you over the pack made me dangerous. And tonight I chose you, without thinking, without hesitating, and the pack is still standing. Better than standing. My sentries just drove off 6 raiders on a border with almost no working wards left. Because they weren't fighting for a pack that felt abandoned. They were fighting for one that just watched its alpha remember what he was protecting it for. He looked up at her, blood loss making his gold eyes glassy but no less steady. I think I had it backward, Juniper. I think loving you was never the danger. I think it was the only thing that was ever going to make me strong enough to actually do this job right. Elin arrived with bandages and a face like thunder, ordering both of them back to the cottage in a voice that brooked no argument, and Juniper let herself be herded, one hand still fisted in the collar of Weston's ruined shirt, refusing, for reasons she wasn't ready to examine too closely, to let go of him the entire walk back. Weston healed fast. Wolves always did. But Elin made him sit still for it anyway, on principle, and Juniper found herself unable to leave the healer's cottage while he did. She told herself it was practicality. Someone needed to change the bandage. Someone needed to watch for fever. Someone needed to make sure the reckless idiot Alpha didn't try to stand up and inspect the border himself 18 hours after being bitten nearly to the bone. She told herself a great many practical things over the following 2 days, and believed almost none of them, and sat beside his cot anyway, close enough that their hands kept finding excuses to brush against each other over the blanket. The 2 unconscious boys woke on the second morning, both at once, both gasping like men surfacing from deep water, and Ilin's shout of relief brought half the pack running to the cottage door. Juniper stood in the doorway and watched color flood back into faces that had been gray and slack for days, watched mothers weep, watched the entire structure of the pack visibly exhale, and understood, in a way she hadn't quite let herself understand before, exactly how close to catastrophe Ashwood Hollow had actually come. The bond stabilizing, Ellen told her quietly that evening, checking the wards with a hand pressed flat against the old oak, the same tree where Weston had knelt 3 days earlier and told Juniper the truth about ward work and mates and blessings he'd never been able to ask for. Not fixed. Not sealed. But it stopped bleeding out. Something shifted. She gave Juniper a long, knowing look that required no further commentary. Juniper found Weston that night, exactly where she'd known she would, at the split oak, standing in almost the same spot as 3 days before, except this time he turned when he heard her coming, no longer bracing himself against the possibility that she might not. "I owe you an actual conversation," he said, "not an apology performance, not a strategic explanation of ward mechanics, just the truth, without any of it being about saving the pack." "Okay," Juniper said, and waited. "I loved you for 2 years before that ceremony," he said, "and I have loved you for every single day of the 3 years since, in a way I never once managed to talk myself out of no matter how hard I tried, and I have tried. Juniper, I have tried so hard it's embarrassing. I told myself rejecting you was protecting the pack. I've since learned it was actually the single most selfish thing I've ever done, because it let me avoid the terror of actually needing someone, of actually being breakable, by breaking the one thing that could have broken me first. I did it to you before I let it get done to me. That's not noble. That's cowardice wearing a noble costume, and I am so sorry it took nearly killing 2 children and starting a war to make me see it clearly. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," Juniper said, and her voice wasn't steady anymore. Hadn't been steady for several sentences. "I'm not asking you to forgive 3 years in one conversation," Weston said. "I know that's not how any of this works. I know I have to earn back every single inch of trust I burned down on that platform, and I know it might take longer than I have patience for, and I'm going to do it anyway, for as long as it takes, whether or not it ends the way I want it to. I just needed you to know, standing right here, with nothing left to lose by saying it, that I love you. I have never once, not for a single day, stopped. Juniper closed the distance between them slowly, giving herself time to feel every step of it, every old fear, and every new, cautious hope. Until she was close enough to rest her palm flat against his chest, over the same wild heartbeat she'd felt 3 nights ago, with her hands full of his blood. I'm not the same person who stood on that platform 3 years ago, she said. I built a whole life without you, Weston. A good one. I'm not going to fold it up and hand it back just because you finally said the words I needed 3 years ago. I don't want you to fold anything up, he said quietly. I want to build something new, something that includes the person you became without me, not a pale imitation of who I lost. Then earn it, Juniper said, and felt something in her chest loosen. A held breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for 3 years finally let go. Slowly, honestly. No platforms. No performances for 200 people. Just this. Just us. Figuring it out one true conversation at a time. I can do that, Weston said. And when he reached up to brush a strand of hair back from her face, his hand trembling slightly, she let him and did not step away. He didn't kiss her that night. It would have been too fast, too easy. A shortcut around 3 years that both of them, in some unspoken agreement, understood needed to be walked through, rather than skipped. Instead, he simply rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in, and Juniper let herself lean into that single point of contact. The two of them standing together at the base of the split oak, while overhead, so faint it might have been imagination, the old wards gave a single low hum, the first sound they'd made in 3 years. The full sealing of the wards took another 6 weeks, 6 weeks of slow, careful rebuilding, of Juniper staying at Ashwood Hollow in her old room, which she found, when she finally went to look, still held every box she'd left behind, untouched, exactly as she'd abandoned it, as though some part of Weston had never quite let himself believe she was gone for good. 6 weeks of long walks along the border, of dinners that started stilted and grew easier, of him showing up at the healer's cottage every evening, not because duty required it, but because he wanted to sit beside her while she worked. 6 weeks of him earning, one honest, unhurried day at a time, the trust he'd shattered on a platform in front of 200 witnesses. There was a particular evening, midway through those 6 weeks, that Juniper would come back to often afterward, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a smooth stone found somewhere unexpected. A storm had rolled in off the western ridge, fast and violent the way autumn storms in the hollow always were, and she'd been caught halfway between the cottage and her old room, with no coat and no umbrella, and considerably more pride than sense, determined to make the walk anyway, rather than admit she needed shelter. Weston found her within minutes, of course, because he always seemed to know exactly where she was, some old habit of tracking her that neither of them had ever discussed, and both of them had apparently never fully let go of. He didn't say anything about the storm, or the coat she wasn't wearing, or the obvious foolishness of her plan. He simply shrugged out of his own coat and settled it over her shoulders. And then, when the rain intensified into something closer to a wall of water, took her hand and pulled her toward the nearest shelter, an old stone grain store at the edge of the eastern field that hadn't been used for actual grain in a generation. Inside, the storm was a distant roar against thick stone walls, and the space smelled of dust and old wood and, faintly, of him a smell Juniper had spent 3 years trying very hard to forget and had apparently failed at completely, given how immediately it undid something in her chest. They stood close together in the dim light, rain hammering the roof, both of them a little breathless from the run, and for a long moment Neither of them said anything at all. "This is where I used to come to think," Weston said eventually, glancing around the small space with something like fondness. "After my father died, before I was ready to be alpha in front of anyone, I used to come here and just exist, for an hour, without 200 people needing something from me." "I didn't know that," Juniper said quietly. "There's a great deal you didn't know," he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "I was very good, for a long time, at making sure no one knew the parts of me that felt breakable. I thought that was strength. I've since revised my opinion." Juniper studied him in the dim gray light filtering through the single narrow window, rain still drumming steady overhead, and felt the careful boundaries she'd been maintaining for 6 weeks soften just slightly, worn down not by any grand gesture, but by the accumulated weight of 100 small, honest moments, exactly like this one. "Tell me something else you never told me," she said. "Something small. Not an apology. Just something true, that you kept from me because you thought it made you weak to say it." He was quiet for a moment, considering, and she watched him actually think about the question rather than deflect it, which felt, in itself, like evidence of exactly how much had shifted over 6 weeks. "I used to watch you work in the kitchens, before we were ever anything to each other," he said finally. "You didn't know I did it. I told myself I was simply patrolling that part of the grounds more often than strictly necessary, which was, in retrospect, an extremely thin excuse that fooled absolutely no one except possibly myself. You hummed while you worked. Off-key. Constantly, I found it unreasonably endearing for a man who was supposed to be thinking about border security." Juniper laughed, surprised into it, the sound bouncing softly off old stone walls. "You never once mentioned that." "I was embarrassed by how much I liked it," he admitted. "It felt like a vulnerability I hadn't earned the right to have yet. I've since learned that most vulnerabilities work that way. You don't earn the right to them. You just decide, eventually, that hiding them costs more than admitting them does." They stayed in the old grain store until the storm passed, talking in a way they hadn't quite managed before, not about the pack, not about wards or bonds or duties, just about small things, ordinary things. The accumulated texture of two people slowly remembering how to be honest with each other, without an audience or a crisis forcing the honesty out of them. When the rain finally eased to a drizzle, Weston walked her the rest of the way to her room, his coat still around her shoulders, and at the door, instead of reaching for her, he simply said goodnight, and meant it as exactly that, an ending to one honest evening. Not a demand for anything more than she'd already, freely, given. It was. Juniper thought later, lying awake and listening to the last of the storm fade outside her window, the first time in 3 years that she had felt entirely unafraid in his presence. Not because he'd promised her anything, not because the wards were sealed or the danger had passed, simply because, for one full evening, he had let her see every part of him he used to hide, without asking for anything back, except the chance to keep doing it, slowly, for as long as it took. The night the wards finally sealed, both of them kneeling at the split oak with their palms pressed together over the old warding stone, Juniper felt the bond settle into place like a held breath finally released warmth flooding back into the border. A low golden hum spreading outward across the whole territory, the pack's collective sigh of relief so tangible she could almost hear 200 people exhale at once, somewhere out there in the dark. Weston's forehead dropped to rest against hers, and this time, when he tilted his head and asked, silently, permission written plainly across his face, she closed the last inch of distance herself, and let the kiss be exactly as slow and careful as everything that had led them back to it. News of the sealed ward spread through Ashwood Hollow before sunrise, the way important news always did in a pack this size, faster than any messenger could carry it, carried instead on some older, quieter frequency that ran under everything. By the time Juniper woke the next morning, there were already 3 separate baskets of bread left outside her door, an old woman's shawl she vaguely recognized from childhood folded neatly on the step, and Rosalind newly presented, newly confident, no longer the shy child Juniper remembered sitting cross-legged on the porch steps waiting for her, grinning like she'd personally engineered the entire reconciliation. "Everyone's saying you saved us," Rosalind announced, the moment Juniper opened the door. "Everyone's exaggerating," Juniper said, though she couldn't quite keep the warmth out of her voice. "Everyone's saying the Alpha finally grew a spine and admitted he loved you in front of the whole Eastern Watch," Rosalind continued, entirely unbothered by correction, "and that you made him earn it back for 6 weeks before you let him kiss you. And honestly, good. He deserved 6 weeks. He probably deserved 60. Juniper laughed a real laugh, the first one that had come easily in longer than she wanted to admit, and let the girl fall into step beside her as she walked toward the healer's cottage, where Elin had promised an update on the 2 boys, both of whom had made a full recovery and had, according to Elin's exasperated report, immediately gotten into a fistfight over whose fault the whole disaster had actually been, which Elin took as reliable proof they were entirely themselves again. She wrote to Delia that week, the first real letter she'd managed since arriving, because some feelings needed a friend's steady handwriting waiting on the other end of them before they could be fully believed. "Delia," she wrote, "I don't know how to explain what's happening here without it sounding like I've lost my mind, so I'm just going to write it plainly and let you decide for yourself. The wards are sealing. The pack is stabilizing. 2 boys who spent a week unconscious on cots are back to arguing over whose fault everything was, which Elin insists is a wonderful sign. And West and I keep starting this sentence and deleting it, which should probably tell you everything. But I'll try again. Weston has spent 6 weeks proving, in small, honest pieces, that the man who stood on that platform 3 years ago was afraid, not cruel, and that he has been paying for that fear every single day since. I don't know what to do with that information. I built an entire life on the certainty that I never needed to know it." Delia's reply arrived a week later, characteristically blunt, characteristically kind, tucked inside a parcel of dried cinnamon sticks and a jar of the good honey Juniper always ran out of first. "You are allowed to have built a good life and still want more of it with someone who hurt you," Delia had written, in handwriting that grew increasingly cramped toward the bottom of the page, the way it always did when she had more to say than room to say it in. "That's not weakness, Junie, and it's not undoing anything you've accomplished. It just means you're a person, and people are allowed to hold 2 true things at once, that they survived something terrible on their own, and that they don't have to keep surviving alone just to prove the terrible thing didn't win. I trust your instincts. I always have. If he's earned even a fraction of your trust back, you'll know it in your body before you know it in your head. You always have. Just don't let 60 years of Eastern Watch gossip talk you into anything faster than you're ready for. And send more of that pack, honey. Ours tastes like nothing in comparison." Juniper read the letter 3 times, sitting on the low stone wall behind the healer's cottage, with the last of the evening light going soft and gold around her, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 long years. Not resolution, not yet, but permission. Permission to want what she wanted without treating the wanting itself as a betrayal of everything she'd survived to build alone. She found Weston later that evening, exactly where she now expected to find him most nights, checking the wards at the Split Oak with the same quiet diligence he brought to everything since the raid, and she sat down beside him without announcing herself, letting the silence between them stretch comfortably, rather than filling it the way she once might have, out of nerves, out of the old habit of needing to manage every gap in conversation before it could turn into something unbearable. Delia says hello, she said eventually, and that she trusts my instincts, and that I'm allowed to have built a good life and still want more of it. Weston turned to look at her, something careful and hopeful crossing his face. And what do your instincts say? That I'm not done being careful, Juniper said honestly. That 6 weeks doesn't erase 3 years, and it shouldn't. But that I'm also tired of treating my own happiness like a threat to everything I survived. Delia's right. I can hold both. I can be proud of the life I built without you, and still want to see what we could build together now, slower, more honestly, with both of us finally telling the truth. Weston reached for her hand, and this time, she let him hold it without the careful, deliberate distance she'd been maintaining for weeks. Let her fingers curl properly around his instead of simply tolerating the contact. Slower, he agreed. More honestly. I can do that for as long as it takes. The formal reckoning, when it came, was not the kind Juniper had expected. She had braced herself, without quite admitting it, for something ceremonial, another platform, another audience, some grand public gesture designed to undo, symbol for symbol, the damage of 3 years before. Weston, it turned out, had other ideas entirely. He found her at dusk, in the garden behind the healer's cottage where she'd taken to sitting most evenings, and instead of a speech, instead of an audience, he simply sat down beside her on the low stone wall, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, and said, "I'm not going to stand on a platform and announce anything about us. Not because I'm ashamed of it. Because the last time I stood on a platform and made a declaration about you, it cost both of us 3 years, and I never want to use that particular stage again for anything that matters this much." Then, "What did you have in mind?" Juniper asked. "Nothing," Weston said. "That's the point. No ceremony. No audience deciding what our story means before we've even finished writing it. Just you and me, deciding, quietly, what we want to build, and letting the pack find out the way normal people find things out, gossip, mostly, and Rosalind, who I understand has already told half the Eastern District that I deserved 60 weeks of penance instead of 6. Juniper laughed again, leaning into his shoulder without quite deciding to. She's not wrong. She's rarely wrong. It's deeply inconvenient. He was quiet a moment, watching the last light fade gold over the tree line. And then, more seriously, "I don't need a ceremony to know what you are to me, Juniper. I spent 3 years finding out exactly how much it costs to pretend otherwise. I'm not interested in performing what I already know to be true. I'd rather just live it, every ordinary day, until it's not a question anyone has to ask anymore." It was, Juniper thought, exactly the right way to begin again, not with the grand public gesture the old Weston would have reached for, the boy who'd needed 200 witnesses to make anything feel real, but with something smaller and steadier, and entirely their own. She let her hand find his on the cool stone between them, and felt him turn his palm up to meet hers, an answer offered without a single word required. The rival pack did not test the border again that season, or the next. Word of Ashwood Hollow's sealed wards and its alpha's fully restored bond traveled through pack channels the way such things always did, and whatever calculation had made the Ironwood Raiders think the Eastern line was worth the risk, quietly, permanently, evaporated. Weston told her once, months later, that the Ironwood Alpha had sent a formal letter of congratulations on the ceiling, which both of them understood to be less a courtesy than a concession, one predator acknowledging that another predator's territory was no longer worth the trouble of testing. Juniper kept the shop, in the end that had been the one condition she'd set early, before either of them had let themselves say the word future out loud, and Weston had agreed to it without a single moment's hesitation, had in fact seemed almost offended she'd thought it needed negotiating at all. She split her time between the city and Ashwood Hollow for the first several months. Delia grumbling good-naturedly about the schedule, but never once suggesting Juniper choose one life over the other. Until eventually, without either of them quite deciding it as a single dramatic moment, the balance simply tipped. More weeks at the Hollow than the city. A second small shopfront opening near the Pack's western gate, where Cinnamon and Cedar drifted out into a marketplace that had, 3 years ago, watched her leave in humiliated silence and now watched her return as something closer to family. Ellen teased her mercilessly about the transition, claiming credit for the entire reconciliation on the grounds that she'd been the one to tell Juniper the truth about bond mechanics in the first place, a claim Weston disputed loudly and often, insisting the credit belonged to 2 idiot sentries whose collapse had finally forced him to face what 3 years of guilt alone had never managed to. Juniper generally let them argue it out over dinner, content simply to watch 2 people who loved her bicker affectionately about who deserved the credit for her happiness, which struck her, more than any grand romantic gesture ever could have, as the truest measure of how far she'd actually come. A year to the night after Weston had shown up bleeding on her shop floor, Juniper stood again at the split oak, this time with no crisis pulling her there, no failing wards demanding her attention, just the ordinary pull of wanting to watch the sunset from the one place in Ashwood Hollow that had come to mean the most to both of them. Weston found her there the way he always did now, not searching, not anxious, simply arriving, the easy certainty of a man who no longer had to wonder whether he'd be welcome. "You're thinking about the rain," he said, settling beside her, close enough that his warmth pressed against her side against the evening chill. "How do you always know that? You get a specific look," he said, somewhere between amused and devastated. "It's very distinctive. I was thinking," Juniper admitted, "that if you hadn't shown up that night, I would probably still be exactly where I was. Successful, independent, perfectly fine." She turned to look at him, the last gold light catching in his eyes the same way it had the very first time she'd seen him, years and years ago, before any of this had happened, before either of them understood what they'd eventually cost each other, and then, slowly, painstakingly, give back. "I don't think perfectly fine and happy were ever quite the same thing, though. I just hadn't let myself notice the difference. I noticed it every single day for 3 years, Weston said quietly. The difference between the life I was protecting and the life I actually wanted. I told myself for a long time that noticing didn't matter, as long as the pack was safe. It took nearly losing everything to understand that the 2 things were never actually in competition. That protecting people well and loving someone fully were never opposites. I just convinced myself they were, because it was easier than admitting I was afraid." Juniper leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sun finish its slow fall behind the western ridge, painting the whole valley the deep gold color she'd come to associate, over the past year, with exactly this tree, this hour, this particular quality of peace that had taken 3 hard years and 1 devastating rejection to finally arrive at honestly. "Ask me," she said quietly. Weston went very still beside her. "Ask you what?" "You know what." She turned to face him fully, her hand finding his in the fading light. "You've been circling it for 2 months, Weston," Rosalind's noticed. Elend's noticed. "I'm fairly certain half the Eastern Watch has a betting pool. I'm not asking you to perform anything for 200 witnesses. I'm asking you to stop circling and just ask me, here, at the only stage that's ever actually mattered to either of us." He laughed an unguarded, disbelieving sound, like a man who'd been caught out and was relieved rather than embarrassed by it, and reached into his coat, and Juniper felt her own breath catch, despite every ounce of teasing certainty in her voice a moment before. "I was going to do this properly," he said. "Flowers, a speech I've actually rehearsed, which for the record took considerably longer to get right than any council address I've ever given. "I don't need the speech," Juniper said, her voice thick now, all the teasing gone out of it. "I just need you. I love you," Weston said simply, kneeling at the base of the split oak where, a year before, he'd told her the truth about ward work and blessings and a mate he'd never let himself ask for. Not the version of me that was afraid to need you. Not the version that thought silence was strength. This version, the one who spent a year proving, one honest day at a time, that he was worth trusting again. I want to build the rest of it with you. All of it. The ordinary days and the hard ones. Marry me, Juniper. Not because a pact bond requires it. Because I can't imagine a single version of my future that doesn't have you standing exactly where you're standing right now. Yes, Juniper said, before he'd even fully finished, and laughed at herself for how fast the word came, how easily, after 3 years of being unable to say it at all. Yes, obviously, yes. He rose and kissed her then, slow and certain, the old oak standing witness the way it had witnessed every honest thing that had passed between them over the last year, and somewhere beneath their joined hands, so faint it might have been imagination, the wards gave a low, warm hum of their own, as though the whole territory had been waiting, right alongside her, for exactly this. 1 year later, the wedding was small, by pack standards no grand platform, no audience of 200 assembled to witness a declaration performed for their benefit rather than lived for the couple's own sake. Just the split oak, decorated simply with late autumn flowers Juniper had grown herself in the shop's garden, and the people who actually mattered gathered close. Delia, who cried through the entire ceremony and denied it fiercely afterward. Elin, who officiated with the gruff efficiency of someone determined not to be caught being sentimental and failed spectacularly. Rosalind, now fully grown into her own confidence, standing as witness with an expression of unbearable smugness, as though she alone had orchestrated the entire reconciliation from the very beginning, which, by her own account, she absolutely had. Juniper stood at the oak in a dress the color of cinnamon, and Weston stood across from her exactly as he had 3 years before, on a very different platform, in front of a very different kind of silence. This time, when he spoke, his voice did not crack with fear or cruelty. It simply said the truth, plainly, the way he'd been practicing for a year, that she was his mate, his equal, the only person he had ever fully needed, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life earning that honor, one ordinary day at a time. When Juniper spoke her own vow back to him, she felt the old wound from 3 years ago finally, fully close over, not erased, never erased, but healed into something stronger for having broken it all. They built their life in the space between 2 homes, the shop in the city, humming with cinnamon and cedar and Delia's steady, unshakable friendship, and the pack at Ashwood Hollow, whole again, wards singing warm and gold along every border. Rosalind eventually took over managing the western shopfront, a fact Juniper found both hilarious and inevitable, given how thoroughly the girl had appointed herself guardian of their happiness from the very first week. Elin and Weston still argued, at every dinner, over who deserved credit for the reconciliation, an argument neither of them had any real interest in resolving, since both clearly enjoyed it too much to let it go. And on quiet evenings, when the pack was settled and the shop was closed, and the whole valley had gone soft and gold with sunset, Juniper and Weston still walked to the split oak together, not because anything required it anymore, not out of ritual or obligation, but simply because it had become, somewhere in the slow unfolding of that hard, honest year, the place that felt most like home, the place where a man had finally stopped protecting everyone by shutting the one person he loved most, and had instead learned, one true conversation at a time, that love was never the danger at all. It had only ever been the thing worth being brave for. Sometimes, on the coldest evenings, When the shop was closed and the fire in the western hearth had burned down to embers, Juniper would take out the old warding stone Weston had given her the night the bond fully sealed, smooth and dark, warm to the touch in a way ordinary stone never should have been, and turn it over in her hands, thinking about the girl who had once stood frozen on a platform, certain that a single rejected word meant she was somehow unworthy of being chosen. She did not resent that girl anymore. She understood her, the way you understand someone you used to be, with tenderness rather than pity. That girl had needed 3 years and an entire life built from scratch to learn that being rejected once did not mean being unworthy forever, and that some of the strongest things a person could do were leave, rebuild, and then, when the truth finally arrived honest and unhurried and worth trusting, choose to come home anyway, not out of need, but out of love, freely given a second time. Weston understood it too, in his own way. He kept, tucked inside his coat, a small folded scrap of paper no one else had ever seen the first line of the speech he'd rehearsed and ultimately abandoned the night he proposed, the one he'd decided, in the end, was too polished, too performed, to say what he actually meant. He never told Juniper what it said. She never asked. Some things, they had both come to understand, mattered more kept quiet and private between two people than spoken loudly enough for an audience to witness. A lesson that had cost them 3 hard years to learn and that neither of them intended to forget again. The pack thrived in the seasons that followed, wards humming steady and gold along every border, centuries strong, harvests generous. The old fear of another Ironwood raid fading slowly into the kind of story pack elders told young pups at the fire, a cautionary tale about what happens when an alpha forgets that strength and vulnerability were never actually opposites. Rosalind grew into a formidable young woman who ran the western shopfront with an efficiency that occasionally embarrassed both Juniper and Delia, and who liked to remind anyone who would listen that she had, in fact, called the entire reconciliation from the very first evening, a claim that grew more elaborate and more certainly true with every retelling. And every year, on the anniversary of the night Weston had shown up bleeding and rain-soaked on Juniper's shop floor, the two of them walked back to the Split Oak together. Just the two of them. No audience, no ceremony, only the quiet, ordinary ritual of remembering exactly how close they had come to losing everything, and exactly how much steadier a love became once it had been tested, broken, and rebuilt with nothing but honesty holding it together. It was not the story either of them would have chosen, given the choice, but it was, in the end, entirely and unmistakably their own. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this one found you at exactly the right moment. I write a new story here every single week, and each one is its own complete world, its own beginning, its own ending, no loose threads left dangling for later. But if a particular story ever stays with you a little longer than the rest, and you find yourself wishing you could spend just a bit more time there, I do share bonus scenes and extra chapters over on my Patreon, for anyone who'd like a little more. Of course, everything you need to enjoy the story is right here, free, every week. The Patreon is simply an extra for those who want it. Thank you again for spending this time with me, and I'll see you very soon for the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, be gentle with your own old wounds, and remember that a second chance, when it's earned honestly, is never a weakness to accept. Good night, and I'll talk to you soon.